really exciting to be here and to imagine how old I feel, that the 16 days is 25 years old, because I didn't think I was that young when we started it. But I want to talk about the 16 days of activism as a campaign that genuinely grew out of the grassroots of the women's movement, and particularly how the whole campaign for women's rights, or human rights, grew out of global feminism from the 1980s. Not because we don't welcome President Hillary Clinton's adoption of this slogan, but because I think it's really important that people understand it takes a movement for these things to happen. It always takes a movement. And it is the women's movement, one of the women's movement, I think, biggest successes from its grassroots has been putting violence against women on the global agenda. There's no issue in my mind that more illustrates the power of women to define our reality. If you look even at the CEDAW Convention, written and initiated in the 1970s and begun from the Copenhagen Conference 1979-80, there's no mention to violence against women. To me, that's the clearest symbol of how much this issue was silenced. And it is the women's movement all over the world, and every country, that brought violence against women onto the agenda. So for me, this is the clearest example, and I mention it because I think sometimes we forget that these things really can come from the grassroots, and the role of organizations like the Center for Women's Global Leadership are to lift that into the international arena, to be the bridge for that. So that's really what the 16 days did. I want to thank Rutgers University and acknowledge our president's wife for being with us, Frances Barchi, because Rutgers has been incredibly generous in giving the center the space to develop this work. I first went as a Laurie Chair for 2 years to work on global feminism and human rights, and had a seminar which Roxana was in, but so was Susanna Freed, one of our early staff people, Neve Riley, people who built the Global Center. And from that work, we were able to convince key people at Rutgers that we could do something with it to put violence against women on the agenda of human rights. But why human rights? Well, for 2 reasons I think that I want to emphasize. We were looking to find a way to lift violence against women out of the private sphere, out of the notion that it was just something that was a little bit too bad and in extreme cases might be criminal, to lift it into a public responsibility of governments and of people who care about human rights. And when we began to look at various issues of violence against women, what we saw is that they actually paralleled many human rights principles. The principle of not being tortured in your own home, not being tortured in public, the principles of having the freedom of speech and assembly, which requires that women be able to leave their homes and go places. And there were women who couldn't even leave their own homes who were not seen as victims of human rights violation. The principles of terrorism, what is sexual harassment and rape, but a form of terrorism against women's control of our bodies, etc. So we began to develop a sense of what it would mean to take the principles of human rights and apply them to women's lives. Now, violence against women is not a standalone issue. It's very interconnected with, I think, all the issues of the women's agenda. But what is particular about it is it happens everywhere, and it illustrates the mechanism of control of women's place in society. And so it was an issue that women everywhere cared about. It allowed us the opportunity through the 80s and early 90s to build a global movement in which we could acknowledge that women from all countries had the problem and nobody had the solution. And this created a really remarkable north-south, east-west collaboration that was crucial to the 16 days of activism success, that it come from everywhere. And as we began Krishanti has mentioned, the particular campaign around the 16 days came out of our first Women's Global Leadership Institute held at Rutgers, where we were trying to figure out how to get people to understand why violence should be seen as a human rights issue. And somebody literally said in a small workshop, well, you know, it's interesting because Human Rights Day is December 10th, and International Day Against Violence Against Women, which is a day that started from the first Latin American feminist encuentro. So again, started from the grassroots of feminism in Latin America. It didn't start at the UN. By 1998, Roxana and women who were in the UN got the UN to declare it, but it started in the feminist movement. So we said there's 16 days. Why don't we focus on those 16 days and call for activism as a way to link human rights and violence against women? So literally, the women, 25 women who were present, all took it back home to their countries and began to build campaigns. Ever Joyce Wynn worked for Women in Law and Development in Africa, built one of the strongest campaigns throughout Africa. Women from all parts of the world built the campaign locally. And I think that the second reason it was important, one was to bring it onto the public agenda, and in bringing onto the public agenda, to make it something that governments felt accountable for, to make it something that governments had to do something about, not just something bad that happened. But the other was we saw that human rights had a very interesting series of mechanisms and ways of calling for accountability in the United Nations, but also in many countries, national human rights commissions, local human rights commissions. And we thought we can learn from people in human rights how to document better, how to call for accountability, how to build this issue into a framework that has this kind of mechanism. Concepts like due diligence, which Yakin has worked on, concepts of how to actually end impunity for this violence. And finally, I guess I want to say that it was individually empowering for women. I remember the first petition we had to the UN to put violence on the 1993 World Conference on Human Rights agenda in Vienna, and we posted it in New Jersey in battered women's shelters, and people reported to us that women would read this petition and say, wow, I didn't know what happened to me was something the UN was trying to talk about. Just the fact that we were petitioning the UN to talk about it, it wasn't even yet really that much on the agenda, was an empowering thing for women to imagine that their problem wasn't just an individual problem. So I think these are some of the reasons why it was so important to do it. I don't think we really imagined that it would take off the way it has, that it would become a campaign celebrated everywhere around the world. But that's what happens when a good idea hits the right moment. And that's what I think we can celebrate today from the 16 days of activism. The final thing I want to say is that, speaking of mechanisms, one of the things the women lawyers who are part of our coalition, and I want to say we were very clear that law and human rights law is an important part of human rights, but that human rights is for people. It isn't just about the lawyers. But we called in feminist lawyers to our campaign, and they said, okay, let's get some of these mechanisms. This is what you need to do. So the first mechanism we sought from the United Nations was what was called a Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. Who had ever heard of a Special Rapporteur? I hadn't. But the notion that the UN had people who reported on issues from around the world, again, was a very empowering thing, that we would have our own mechanism. We would have someone who, in a sense, responded to this movement that had come from women around the world. So that was really very much what we were thinking about in those early years in the 1990s. And I would now like to kind of invite Yakin, who has been one of those rapporteurs, the second one, and also worked both inside the UN and outside, sort of to reflect on how you've seen this evolution.
Well, thank you very much, Charlotte. Well, it's fascinating to sort of sit and listen to you and to realize how things unfolded in a maybe unimaginable way, but they have. And I think one of the successes of the 16-day campaign is precisely the linkage of creating a culture that incorporates the global and the local. And many people who talk about human rights being a Western invention, I don't think realize that particularly in the women's movement, this is simply not true, because it is that collective movement that linked one another to one another, that created its own culture and then unfolded into UN mechanisms, is what makes the women's rights agenda so powerful, despite of all the transgressions against it. It has become a very empowering process. Now, in the 1990s, of course, in general, was a remarkable period. I was not yet in the UN, but I was doing development work for the UN at that time. But what was so special about the 1990s was precisely what the 16 days of activism created, that momentum, which unfolded into UN activities as well. And thanks to many women inside and outside of the UN who pushed the UN to act on behalf of women's rights. The whole 1990s was sort of like a workshop where one conference after another unfolded. It created interest. It created people to ask questions if they had not before. It created mobilization of resources which were available for small projects at that time. And I remember with the Beijing process, there was a lot of UN resources being distributed, where I used one such very small resource to do rural development work, which took the message down to the grassroots level. So it was a trickling down effect, really. But interestingly, in Turkey, the women's movement, which started organizing in the 1980s after one of very harsh military interventions, all movements were crushed, of course, the left in particular. So women seized the opportunity, particularly women from the left organizations, created the feminist movement. And one of the first street events that they had organized was the one on violence against women in the 1980s. I think this is very interesting because it was there. The woman went to the streets, and at that time, they were not taken very seriously. There were cynical reports in the newspapers and so forth. Well, you know all that, because until recently, what women demanded was not taken very seriously. But now it's taken too seriously that they want to crush it altogether. It is interesting. So in the 1990s, what that new momentum and the linkage between the global and the local, these kinds of campaigns, 16-day campaigns, and the UN opening its door really empowered women in all countries to civil society and the state working together. I think that was very critical. The women's movement in Turkey was not strong enough to take on the show on its own, and the state mechanism was too weak in terms of the knowledge on women's issues. So the two really worked together towards the Beijing process. So that was very, very empowering. And when the global language moved into the area of violence, it really empowered these local movements, which had started earlier but couldn't get their voices institutionalized. I think in that sense, we need to realize how the local and the global processes really are intermingled. And that's the basis of the story of the women's movement, I think. As far as the UN mechanisms go, I think I'll talk about that a little later, because the 1990s was still a trying moment, and the development discourse was still the dominant discourse at that time, and it was a very important discourse, of course, but I think the violence against women agenda had the greater transformative impact than any other agenda prior to it. And the reason for that was because it demystified the myths. It challenged the taboos head on, and it went into the private sphere and questioned the intimate relationships. So a taboo is a taboo only as long as you let it remain a taboo. I think now the Pandora's box is open. And despite all the attacks that we'll probably touch upon during this course, it's going to be a tough fight for everybody. So maybe I'll stop there and then move on to some of the more current issues.
Great. No, I think I'm going to pick up on what Yakin said about the 1990s being, I now look back on it, I try not to be nostalgic, but if we do look back on it as kind of a really, a very special time in which here in the United States we saw the end of the Cold War, which meant the end of sort of the blockade around human rights and as a matter of the old East-West communist socialist discussion. I think we did not see it opening as much as we wanted, but it meant for the first time that you could begin to discuss social and economic rights, even in the United States, which had not been possible. The division between civil and political rights and social and economic rights was almost complete up until the end of the Cold War because it had been framed in that Cold War context. What it meant for women, I remember very well when we first started organizing, they would say to us that they being the human rights gurus, so is violence against women a political and civil rights issue or a social and economic rights issue? And we would say, well, why does it have to be one or the other? It's clearly about both. And I think it was really important that we were entering that discussion at a moment when social and economic rights was finally able to get a wider space and was in the Vienna conference, in addition to women's rights, one of the other major pushes was around the right for development and the social and economic rights issue. And we were just at the right moment to say, these old divisions don't work. I think particularly for women, there's very few issues where one kind of right isn't affected by the other. And it was also true that we were challenging the division of state and non-state actors. Because yes, there are some state actor violations, and particularly when you begin to look at women, peace, and security and what the state does and rape and war, but they're also constantly interfacing with private actors and what is the state's responsibility. So I think the 1990s was a moment when those kinds of divisions were being opened up, and feminist analysis of public and private really allowed us, but also other people who were talking about children's rights, which are also issues where you cross over public and private, indigenous rights, other issues where these divisions weren't working. So it was really the ferment of that era. And I really want to reinforce what you said. I think one of the biggest mistakes that my sisters in academia have made is to think that all this human rights ferment is Western. Because in fact, the women's rights ferment around human rights mostly came from Latin America, where women had been dealing with military dictatorships. It came from the Philippines, where women had been dealing with Marcos and a military dictatorship. It came from Turkey. It came from countries where women had seen the power of human rights. In fact, I would say today that the United States is still the hardest place to get anybody to understand that violence against women and other women's rights issues really are human rights issues, because we have a continuing mythology that separates international human rights from national everyday struggles. Most people in the world don't make that separation. This is something that those of us who've worked globally have sought to overcome, and something I think we might, unfortunately, be able to see a little more clearly in the next 4 years the ways in which domestic struggles really are and must be seen as human rights struggles around the globe, both women and social and economic rights issues. So that history, I think, gave us a sense of crossing boundaries and borders, that women's human rights had to cross boundaries and borders, both boundaries of what was called public and private, boundaries of North and South. And in that process, one of the key issues that we were taking on was the issue of culture. And in the 1990s, the discussion about culture was very lively because we, I think, understood then that all of our cultures were oppressive to women. All of our cultures condoned in some form violence against women, whether in traditional ways or in contemporary ways. Contemporary media was clearly a big part of violence against women in the United States, and that's culture. We call it the culture wars in the US. What happened, I think, after 9/11 and the war on terrorism and the whole shift to a focus on the security state is that governments began to divide the world around these issues of culture. And women have fought that, but we have not been, I think, successful in really resisting the way in which governments after 9/11, in our case, President Bush, using women's issues to justify the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and in other cases, governments that were oppressive at home using, quotes, Western imperialism or Western wars to justify denying rights to women in their own countries in the so-called name of culture and religion, created a divide that we as women are still struggling with. A divide which feminists don't share, but I think we have not controlled the debate. I think that the media and the world in the United Nations and so forth has pulled the rug out from under us when we understood that culture was something we were all working to change. And I continue to talk to people about the importance of seeing culture as everywhere. The US has culture. We call it the culture wars when we have opposition to women's rights, to sexual rights, when we have the link that gets made in the opposition to CEDAW between abortion and lesbian and gay rights is why they won't pass the ERA or CEDAW. We have culture wars. We know we have culture wars. Well, those are not all that different from culture wars around the world, where women and women's sexuality in particular and issues of the role of women in the family are the kind of flashpoint for issues of power in relation to women. So I think that it's very important, and I would like to have Yakin talk some about how she's tackled these issues of culture, because as a person from the United States, I feel we in the US have to do a much more serious critique of our own culture and how it perpetuates both violence against women, but also how it uses maybe a 25 to 40-year history of starting to change some of these policies as if that were somehow the history of the West, which we know it is not. The history of the West is extremely patriarchal, starts from the notion of women as property. Rape was a crime against honor in most Western countries until quite recently. We share this history with our sisters elsewhere. We sometimes see it taking different forms. But how do we get back to that shared sense of relating to culture in a world that is now using these as opposition to women?
Well, yes, this is an area that has always intrigued me. But I just want to go back to the first issue we were talking, just one factual information. With the 16-day campaign, my good friend, feminist lawyer, Canan Aran, whom you may know, she introduced it in Turkey, and I think in 1991, shortly after the launch, or 1992, 75,000 signatures were given accepting this. So I think that's a very important thing to sort of put in the back of our minds how it was received by people on the ground. Coming back to culture, during my period as UN Rapporteur, this issue, of course, became a major preoccupation for me. And I saw that one of the most serious challenges to women's rights issues, to preventing, eradicating violence against women, is culture-based references. Not culture itself. Cultures don't kill, people kill. And so I became very much engulfed in this issue because when I took on, I don't have a legal background. I'm a sociologist. And as Charlotte said, human rights is not about lawyers and legal texts, although that has become sort of the dominant notion. But due diligence is one of the major concepts that exists over and over again in many of the documents. So I took a very simple and very naive position, and I said, what does it mean for a state to be diligent? And that question I picked up and used it as one of my thematic reports for the Human Rights Council. When I first introduced this idea, many people were a little skeptical. They said, well, this woman doesn't know what she's talking about. We even had a brainstorming session in Bern. You couldn't come because you were not well at that time, I think. But we had about 20 people from different backgrounds. And by the end of that meeting, everybody was very excited about this project. And what I saw when I wrote the report, that due diligence was being interpreted by states in a very narrow way to protect and to prosecute, whereas the due diligence concept involves prevention, protection, prevention, and compensation. But of course, for states, the easiest thing to do is to protect women because these are weaklings, poor women who need to be protected. And that concept of poor woman, I have heard from even the highest defenders of human rights concepts. Unfortunately, it still exists. And of course, the punitive system, which is the easiest way of intervening. And even on those grounds, of course, states have failed notoriously. But prevention, nothing there. So in the process, I saw one of the two areas that really seriously prevented states from having a broad understanding is the issue of culture. Because in order to prevent, you have to touch on these culturally sensitive areas, supposedly, or politically risky areas, because you don't want to upset your constituents. And political economy, the economic material basis of life. And this led me to devote the following reports on these issues. Now, why is culture so strong an obstacle to human rights and women's rights in particular? First of all, it's a very appealing area. You can sell culture very easily. Secondly, it's a way that those in power legitimize their position. I remember when I was presenting to the General Assembly one of my reports, I talked about the need to stop stoning as a way of punishing a woman. One delegate took the floor. He was very upset with me. He said, our religion, and blah, blah, blah. He went on. I said, excuse me, sir. I'm Muslim, and I don't give you the right to talk on behalf of my religion in this way. But the thing is, this is a very difficult battle because those who use culture use it in a very intimidating manner. And as I said, it is because they intimidate, you shy away from it. So the dominant cultural paradigm prevails. Those who have the power tell you what your culture is. And they excuse their failings in the human rights area as a result of our culture. And you hear, over and over again, I have heard this from all authorities. I visited 17 countries. One of the last countries that I visited was Moldova, and we were visiting Moldova with the torture rapporteur, so it was a very highly received visit, both, not because of the violence against women mandate, but torture mandate, Manfred Novak and I. So we took advantage, of course, of the importance that the state gave to this visit. Anyway, we were with the head prosecutor, and I started asking the prosecutor a few questions about women's issues, trafficking and other issues. And he said, well, Madame Erturk, our culture, the same line. I said, excuse me, Mr. Prosecutor, with all due respect, I hear this from all authorities. So let's not do injustice to the Moldovan culture. And then he laughed. I said, maybe you're talking more about patriarchal culture that is so universal. And I think the whole clash of alliances pieces that took the wars after the Cold War from mega ideologies to the sphere of culture use this very much. We are clashing civilizations, but the Afghan war and everything else clearly shows us that it's more about clash of masculinities than clash of civilizations. My civilization is not all that different than your civilization in terms of human dignity and human rights. But those who are claiming the platform of what civilization is and what culture is are really reflecting dominant patriarchal forms. And in Afghanistan, it was American soldiers versus the Taliban. American soldiers wanted to free the woman from the archaic Taliban, and the Taliban wanted to protect the woman from Western's corruption. So where was culture? Where was the rights of women? Today, years after the intervention in Afghanistan, we see those who fought to take civilized culture to Afghanistan contemplating negotiations with the Taliban. So it's a very slippery ground, and I think we really need to be very, very vigilant about these cultural claims. I have 2 minutes, so I'll just squeeze in something very, very urgent, and that is the issue of child marriages, which is becoming such a important problem, which has always been. But just last week, you may have heard from the media, there was a motion to the Turkish parliament to be inserted into a reform package that called for pardoning child sexual abusers if the abuser married the girl. I mean, they didn't say the girl, of course. It was a child. But given that same-sex marriage is not allowed in Turkey, it was definitely targeting the perpetrators of those who have violated girls. Whereas the perpetrator who violates a boy, which is also very common, is punished. But the one for girl is not. So it's pardon. I wrote something on this, and I think on Friday it will come out in the Open Democracy. So if you're interested, you could read a little bit more there. But just to mention that it's not only happening in a Muslim majority society. In Canada, there's an ongoing case of polygamous members of a polygamous community who are practicing child marriage, and they call it God's will. God's will. It's too close to all of us, and we cannot be intimidated that it's God's will or that it's culture, our culture, or that. So I think it's a battle that needs to be constantly fought. We need to constantly unpack cultural discourses, interrogate them, and uncover their gender biases and how it serves masculine and patriarchal values, whether at the global level or at the very local levels.
Great. That actually brings me to where we are today. I think, unfortunately, in the U.S., we've just seen a really good illustration of how right-wing forces use culture. What is Make America Great Again about? Make America Great Again is a cultural argument about racism, about the role of women, about a certain concept of America from the 50s, if not before, This is a cultural argument. It has nothing to do with the economy, even though it's cloaked in, economic jobs issues. And I use that as an illustration because I think that cultural arguments are very powerful and are in the resurgence right now around the globe. Nationalist cultural arguments. Look at the Philippines, where Marcos, who the feminists fought against, just got burial as a hero. Look, of course, at Europe and Brexit and all of those things. We see a resurgence of nationalism, and nationalism inherently brings both racist and sexist ideas about who belongs to the nation and about how you preserve the, quote, purity of that nation. Ideologies which have deep roots in the United States. You can look back at all kinds of racist literature which is deeply rooted in the idea of making sure that white women reproduce white children. I was just shockingly reading a recent one from 100 years ago. It's just there so deeply. So I want to be sure that we in the US are very clear that human rights and change toward a more inclusive society and social justice always involves cultural change. Cultural change is part of any change. So we also have to recognize I'm really disturbed when I hear people in the US and women in particular saying, well, we can't disturb the culture of women elsewhere. Well, it's not us who want to disturb the culture of women elsewhere. It's women elsewhere who are trying to change their cultures, just like we're trying to change our culture. Our job is not to go and change their cultures. Our job is to be in solidarity from an understanding of how we are fighting to change our culture. And if this wasn't clear before this election, I think it's become even more clear how deeply rooted patriarchal, sexist, racist ideas are in US culture in spite of the changes we've made. So hopefully our sisters who struggled through some of these same kinds of periods that we are facing about a government that doesn't represent us will help remind us of the strategies for that. I remember the shock we all felt in 1980 when Reagan was elected, or I felt in 1968 when Nixon was elected. We do survive these changes, but I think we have to be very smart about understanding what's going on and making strategies that continue to be linked to women around the world who are also facing this kind of nationalist xenophobic resurgence that is going on, especially in Europe and the United States in terms of xenophobic, but also in many other parts of the world, with the right-wing legislative coup in Brazil against a woman leader who was representing progressive forces. I mean, we see it all over. So I think that the strategy questions that we need to be talking about is sort of what are the challenges today? And I think the eradication of violence against women, which is our theme, is totally linked to how we continue to build a culture of respect for human rights. Because to me, I didn't say this earlier, but I think you implied it, there is a very strong, and Marie did, there's a very strong link between violence against women and the willingness to violate other people, the willingness to commit wars and violence against others. It is very strongly linked. There, literature is finally showing what we all felt instinctively, that these are linked. So part of our task in the face of the political moment is to think about how do we keep linking the respect for human rights that we seek across these many different lines. And I think the basis of coalition in the United States has been growing. I think there's been a lot more understanding of the linkage of different movements domestically. I'm not sure how much that has crossed over into seeing how we're a part of the global picture, but we need to be doing that more. We need to see that the treatment of refugees and migrants is another extension of the treatment of racial minorities and women in our own country. The ways in which we must counter all of this. I don't have an exact strategy, but I want to start just by saying people have been through terrible times before. If you want to go back to World War II, if you want to go back to 1950s McCarthyism, if you want to go to Cambodia and the killing fields, if you want to go internationally, I mean, there are terrible things that happen. It's not a moment to therefore say, even though the New Yorker cartoon that I love says, set the alarm for 2020, it's not a moment to sit out the next 4 years until we have another election. It is a moment in which we build together with each other, not just resistance, but positive visions of how we want these things to come together. And I think we have to defend gains both in the national governments and at the UN, continue to see the UN as a place where these battles are also being fought with women elsewhere. Women, peace, and security has certainly been a key arena for that, and we all know that we're all kind of engaged in trying to figure out where does that agenda go when getting women on the agenda hasn't solved the problem, and what does it really mean? Where do we need to go? So it's a time of a lot of rethinking, but I don't think it's a time of backtracking. If anything, I would say that the challenge out there is to link issues more substantially, to see more clearly that gains in one arena, the single issue approach that's so prevalent still in US politics is not the approach to changing a broader picture. It really is about linking forces and linking together. And I do think that women around the world have a lot to teach women in the United States today about how you survive when the government is really against you, and how we build that survival together, and how we think about violence against women not just as an individual act, but as a manifestation of the values of society. And to me, maybe the one thing that we can build on around violence against women is there has been an enormous amount of awareness raising, as Krishnanji said, awareness to eradication. In the last 5 to 10 years in the UN and around the world, more and more groups have committed themselves, have said they're committed to ending violence. To me, it's like the tip of the iceberg. It's not happening yet. How do we think about going from that commitment, which is there on paper, to what would it really take to do that? To engaging those forces that have said, and this is pretty widespread, from governments to many corporations and others who've said they're against this, to really demanding that they start to take actions that really change the conditions that lead to that. And we can talk about more specific strategies, or people can ask about specifics. But I think that that's the direction that awareness to eradication takes us. We do have a much higher basis of awareness. We have some acceptance of human rights, but we also are in a moment when human rights itself is being questioned. I don't think we give up the link of violence to human rights. I think we say, indeed, that as human rights are being questioned, that's because human rights is the bulwark against violence. That is what human rights is supposed to be. So we need to join with human rights organizations, with development organizations, with feminists around the world in reasserting what it means to stand against those kinds of forces. I know personally I'm kind of obsessed with, in the United States, Standing Rock and what we're doing to the Native Americans. It's not necessarily the long-term agenda, but our ability to stand behind people who are being ousted from their land at this very moment, even before Trump has come into power. even with our current government. Seems like a kind of symbolic place to begin. I'm not saying that's the agenda for 4 years, but if we could stand up for that now, maybe we can remember the solidarity that it takes to stand behind those who are fighting for human rights, and to make the women's participation in that and the violence that women experience, to keep that at the core of what we're doing, both locally and globally. I want to say something about the SDGs, but let me turn to you, and then we can come back to something more about the UN.
Well, I think we're at a point now where we really have to take stock of what happened and how things are unfolding in the world, what is happening, read what is happening in world dynamics sufficiently so that we can envisage a new vision, a new feminist vision, and how we're going to get there. So far, of course, we've been working mainly in a liberal paradigm, which has generated many success stories, and it is these successes that have provoked backlash. Many of the issues that we're worried about is partially a reaction to the success of women. But the fight, obviously, is nowhere near, as we can see. So how do we move further? Now, the enthusiasm of the 1990s as far as state commitment to human rights definitely is not there. And I don't see any one state in the world today where I could say they are truly committed. Even those that have succeeded to support women's rights issues are faced with political developments that are, for example, Sweden, which is one of the countries that I did visit as a special rapporteur, and saw how deeply rooted the concept or the principle of equality in social democracies and that society, but they themselves are now being threatened by the growth of a very nationalist right-wing party, which is throughout Europe. So nowhere can we say with ease that we have made it and there's no going back. Unfortunately, there is a going back. But there's no going back in demanding rights, that's for sure. And we need to work hard in that area. Now, I think what has happened is, particularly since the ending of the Cold War, that existing nation-state modality of the world has become destabilized. This destabilization has triggered violence at very different levels. And violence against women, of course, which always existed, but different dynamics are at work today, is very much linked to the violence on the street, the violence in other spheres. So I very much agree with Anne-Marie's emphasis on that point. So we need to, and at the same time, we have reached a level where there is a comprehensive international legal system, but there is no international state, to use this awkward term, to implement the universal standards. So I think that's one of the major tensions that we are seeing. On the contrary, today there is a going back to clinging on to national boundaries to protect. After 9/11, I think the national security paradigm became very prominent, and the refugee crisis is the number one issue today that is supporting what happened in the United States elections and what is supporting many of the right-wing movements in Europe. Let's recall the agreement of the European Union with Turkey, which I think is a shameful one, which is a regression, open regression of commitment to human rights. Just keep those people away, we'll turn the blind eye. This is what it boils down to. This is how much human rights is respected today. So we really have a very difficult moment. Now, the extremist movements, ISIS, operating not outside of my borders, but right within my borders today. It's very threatening. And the thing is, we are all very much interlinked. I mean, the fact that you are not living with ISIS side to side does not protect you from the threats of ISIS, as the election campaign clearly showed. So we're all very much affected by the same thing. But unfortunately, people have a sort of a very short-sighted understanding. Just not too long ago, we were discussing I was in Canada, and we were discussing these very issues. And one politician, she said, well, at least the UN succeeded in preventing the Third World War. I said, you're wrong. We are in the Third World War. The wars today are not fought the way they were fought in the past. It's happening every minute. 9/11 was a manifestation of the Third World War, and so forth. So I think we need to have a vision which goes beyond the terminology that was defined in a different world order. We need to redefine our concepts. So how do we move forward is a serious question. And of course, I don't have all the answers. I don't have any of the answers for that matter. But where are some of the difficulties? And maybe some very practical issues. First of all, I think we really need to envisage a new feminist vision. How do we deal as feminists with all these new emerging issues so that we can offer something as a way forward? And there, our concepts are important, our language is important. How has the term gender gone astray? Let's put gender back and discuss what has happened with it. I have talked about these things many times, and I have written on them, so I won't dwell more and more. But equality and equity, this was a big fight during Beijing conference, and we forgot all that. Equity is everywhere today. Feminists are using it, UN is using it. My president is promoting gender justice as a concept against gender equality. And they are creating their own pro-state NGO, women's NGOs, to follow this up. So the fight is on all levels. Gender mainstreaming was always a problematic concept. In one of my visits in Algeria, I was visiting a police station in a province. The police officer wanted to impress me. He said, we do gender mainstreaming. I said, what do you do? He said, during the month of Ramadan, we let our female police go home early so they can cook the dinner in town. But he was serious. He was not making a joke. Right. So anyway, male streaming or mainstreaming, what are we doing? The UN, unfortunately, is facing a serious crisis today. And it's not even being addressed. But in terms of violence against women, there's a suggestion on the table. My successor, Rashida Manjoo, is very much promoting the idea of a global mechanism on violence against women. As you know, the Istanbul Convention is a regional one. And along those lines, she's proposing, and many others are proposing. Now, I'm a little bit skeptical about this because, I believe that we should adopt the concept of interlocking obligations and push this on states, because there are definitely many mechanisms which can be used to deal with issues without discrimination and equality. Two basic concepts of almost all UN treaties. States love to create new mechanisms because it makes them look good. They get applauded. They have created another mechanism. But then, how do you apply it? Look at CEDAW. It's nearly universally ratified, but how much is it applied? So we need to be careful about these. I would push the states to put resources for follow-up mechanisms of existing mandates and treaties, rather than constantly creating new ones. Of course, there will always be some area where we need new legal standard, but let's not rush into that. That's the easy part. Let's deal with the more difficult areas and hold states accountable. I have to stop because the zero is looking at me very fiercely. Okay.
Right. Well, maybe a good place to end. I want to just say that November 29th, yesterday, was International Women's Human Rights Defenders Day. And that is a day that the Center for Women's Global Leadership was a part of creating in another coalition in response to the situation of women activists around the world who are defending human rights, women's rights, and other human rights issues. And I encourage any of you who just feel like you want to take an action today to go to the website, very easy to remember, defendingwomen-defendingrights.org, which is the Women's Human Rights Defenders International Coalition website, which has cases from Mexico, Egypt, Bahrain, Turkey, and Thailand that all need urgent action in terms of letters and support. I think that's just one of many symbolic actions, but right now I think defending our sisters and ourselves, and I think there are going to be more of these in the United States as we find challenges to women. Those of us who are going to march in January need to be ready to defend sisters there. It's a time to remember that we are a part of a worldwide network of women who are challenging issues of the human rights of women, and where violence against women is both an issue that women are challenging in the private sphere and something that is being used against the women who are challenging it. Many women are being threatened by greater violence, and both the Women's Human Rights Defenders, AWID, have constant information about this. I think it's a good place to end because it reminds us that in spite of being discouraged in the past month, we have to remember it hasn't stopped women's activism. Women's activism is still very alive, including in this country. I've never seen as much as I have in the last few weeks about women being ready to reactivate themselves domestically as well as internationally. And I think we build on remembering where Krishanti started, that in spite of not being the president, Hillary did get 2 million more votes. We are not living in a country that has given a mandate to Trumpism. Trumpism and Republican right-wing power has used the system very effectively, but that doesn't represent more than 25 or 26% of the population. So we have our own mandate to continue to build forms of not just resistance, but counter ways of organizing, and I think particularly taking our power. The state of New Mexico, where I grew up, has 3 women heading the Democratic legislature, a Native American, an African American, and a Latina American. So there are good signs at the local and state level. Women of color have more representation in Congress and state legislatures than ever. We build on those things. We remember that the struggle is continuing, and violence against women, I think, is both a cause and a consequence, as we used to say, in the Special Rapporteur's mandate, as a cause and a consequence of women's activism. So the 16 days will continue to lift this up and to offer space for those who want to come together to end violence and keep the flag of human rights moving in the international and the local level. So thank you, Krishanti. Right.
Can I just say one last word or sentence? I think we have forgotten about a very important concept when it comes to women's rights: secularism. Let's rethink secularism, because with all its handicaps or problems, I think it's a starting point. Without a secular legal order, we don't have a fighting chance. All this promotion of liberal Islam, which the Western world saw as being appropriate for Turkey, is now facing something not so liberal. So let's rethink of secularism. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.